I gave a speech, oh, probably 20, maybe 22 years ago, maybe even a little longer than that. Definitely somewhere between 1998 and 2002. What's interesting about this speech is a lot of people remember it. I've had it brought up to me several times, which is interesting. And the speech was about abortion and dealing with it as a libertarian issue. Now, because of the amount of time that's passed, and to a certain extent, the change of circumstances, and obviously our views on things drift over time, this obviously can't be that speech. Uh, it's going to be a tribute to that speech in the spirit of Tenacious D, perhaps. What was probably the most remarkable about the speech is uh, when it was done, I had several people tell me I'd changed their mind, which really caught me off guard because obviously that's what you kind of hope for. But how many times have you actually had somebody come up and tell you you've changed their mind? I mean, typically you get the people who agree with you saying, "Hey, great speech. You said all the things I agree with, so yeah, good talk." So obviously I remember it, and it's probably one of the few times I've heard that in my life where people were specifically saying that. So I guess in order to fully grasp what we're going to talk about, it's probably a good idea to understand what my personal views on abortion are in the first place. Uh, I've always disliked the issue itself because it's so divisive, especially when I was very politically active. Probably one of the most awful, gut wrenching things to have happen was here you are in a nice meeting where people are being cordial and interesting ideas are being advanced, and all of a sudden abortion comes up, and you're like, it's like somebody basically dropped a water balloon full of poop into the middle because it there was no way to resolve it, and steering people away from it was almost impossible. And so, really, not just merely I dislike the topic just because of how hard it is uh, to get people to agree to anything on it. Uh, in general, I do believe life begins at conception. I do believe that abortion is terminating a life. I've never had Malthusian notions of population, so it's the idea that we are going to overpopulate if we don't have abortion is pretty much ludicrous to me. Everything in economics pretty much says that is impossible. Now, probably in that area, the one thing where I have changed my mind a bit uh, is I do believe we are at a point where we could actually be facing uh, a population implosion uh, due to the graying of the population, where essentially not having enough births is really going to cause us severe problems. Actual uh, either incredible stagnation or possibly even setbacks. So this is kind of new to my thinking. Uh, but the probably the biggest thing that I have in terms of my viewpoints on abortion is that I look at both sides of the issue. I look at the life of the baby, and I am looking at the liberty of the mother. and I empathize equally and strongly with both sides. And it's not a cop-out answer. It's the conclusion I come to because of how I look at things philosophically. So I'll get into that in a moment. So one of the things that that alters things is obviously the Dobbs decision. Uh, at the time when I gave this speech, the idea that the Supreme Court would ever completely overrule Roe v. Wade just seemed pretty much wholly unlikely. And so I believed that any kind of changes were going to have to come up from the ground up in a very gradual manner. Now, to be clear, I always hoped something like that would happen because I do believe the Roe v. Wade decision as it was given was an incorrect decision. The Supreme Court basically fabricated powers of the government that do not exist. And so, although I always hoped this would happen, since I didn't think it would happen, I never went to the point where I considered fully what would happen. So, like, my state uh, is a state that's leaning towards restricting abortion severely. And I don't know entirely where I want to draw the line here because I never got to the point where I had to actually seriously think it out because I never thought it was coming. So, I guess talking about the libertarian view on abortion. And the Libertarian Party is pretty much split down the center on this idea. And if you look at it from a rights perspective, and I invite you to check out my video on rights, or otherwise you aren't going to understand fully what I'm talking about here. I do believe rights are absolute. I also believe that no one right triumphs over another right. You don't have one right. One right doesn't get to overtake another right. So what we have in terms of libertarian view is on one side you have a life, and a life has a right to life, human that is. And on the other side, we have a woman who carries a baby to term. And carrying a baby to term is a significant impact on liberty. And the woman has a right to liberty. So, because I believe rights don't trump each other, and I believe rights are absolute, this is an area where I see them coming into conflict in a way that I don't have a satisfactory answer for. I'm not comfortable pushing in either direction. And again, it's not, I don't think I'm copping out. I think I'm staying true to my understanding of what a right is. You can disagree with my philosophy, but unless you bring up some. So, in order to alter my view on how this life versus liberty conflict works out, you need to alter my views of how I view rights in the first place. And if you need to, feel free. I'm always happy to re-examine my views on things. Okay, so one concept I think a lot of people aren't aware of. There was a author, I think he's passed away. I'm not 100% sure. Richard Mayberry, probably his most famous books were he was writing as if an uncle to his nephew, and the nephew would ask questions, and it's like, whatever happened to penny candy, and what is inflation? And they are really good books because they essentially take uh, fairly complicated ideas and distill them down to probably like a sixth grade or even a fourth grade level. It's still very readable for an adult, and it can bring some really complicated concepts into understanding. And one of the things he talked about was the idea of essentially common law, and I'm going to describe it as an organic process versus political law. And the idea was with the whole common law or organic law, what would happen is judicially things would occur at the lowest level, where a judge would look at the various precedents that had been set up, and then when a new situation would come up, they would make a slight alteration to the general view of things. So instead of just saying, "Oh well, yeah, that whole idea is now just completely gone," they would figure out how to either add an exception or alter it in such a way where it's like, oh, everyone would say, okay, yeah, that changed, but it's still familiar. We all get what's going on. And so the idea is, if law or the judgment of law occurs at a slow organic pace, what ends up happening in the end is we reach a conclusion that pretty much everyone can agree on, because we don't have rapid sudden changes, and each little change is a very well thought out response to a specific situation. And so these exceptions, depending on how you look at it, or depending on what actually happened, they might be universal or they may be very limited in scope. And because of the way the way they work themselves out, people are generally happy with the results. Now, political decisions, on the other hand, is essentially when either one group manages to get a majority plus one person, or 50% plus one person, excuse me, or the bench decides to rule on something in a way that people weren't really ready for. And so you get this very earth shattering change. And Roe v. Wade is a very good example of that. And one of the things I've been trying to say to people is, okay, look, let's say you were in favor of Roe v. Wade and you really liked it, et cetera, et cetera. For a moment, imagine how people who were pro-life felt at that very moment when that came down. Well, it's exactly the same way you felt when the Dobbs decision occurred. Uh, it's an empathy thing. I mean, if you understand, if you try to understand what the other side felt, maybe you'll understand that there isn't malice involved with this. It's not like, haha, we won and now we're going to force you to do something. It's more along the line of, you know, we had this horrible, heart wrenching thing happen to us. Uh, Now you know what we felt like. So maybe we can find some way to have a little bit of common ground on this. Okay, so something that I did not have available to me at the time was a good story. And so I'm going to tell you a story. Some of you might recognize it, but it's very useful in understanding what ends up, uh, where I'm going with this whole talk. So a friend of mine was a locksmith in the area, and every once in a while he gets some really weird, hairy jobs, and he'd give me a call and say, "Hey, dude, can you ride shotgun with me because uh, got a weird one here and I'm a little uncomfortable," which I was always happy to do because it gave me a story. In this particular case, he got a call, and it was a relative of a person who had died. And the person died in their house, and they weren't found for over 2 weeks. I believe it was summer. And the only reason the body was discovered is because the neighbors started smelling it as they left their houses. Now, at this point, the body had already been removed from the house, but no type of cleanup had occurred. So we get to the location, and the relative gives us some Vicks, and we rub that under our nose, and we put on a mask over our face, and you open the door, and it's just unbelievable. It's just, you wouldn't believe a smell can actually like smack you in the head. It was just like, because obviously it's kind of solemn. This is a place where a person died. There's a relative right there. You're trying to maintain decorum, and the reaction is like, oh God, even with the mask and the Vicks. And I can't imagine what it would have been like without it. And so inside the house, there's a spot on the carpet where the body had been, and it's pretty I mean, 2 weeks. It's pretty grody, pretty disgusting. And so, I'm helping out what little I can, because if you guys know my incredible mechanical skills, at best I can do is hand you screwdrivers and wrenches. But so we're in there doing our work, and the relative turns on one of those old timey uh, telephone answering machines. Now, up until this point, I just kind of assumed, okay, well, I don't know the full details of it. This must have been a really old person that, essentially nobody really was paying attention to, and this just happens. So then the voicemail machine is going off. So beep. Hey, blah blah blah. We missed you today. Blah 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 blah. Hope everything's okay, etc. etc. And turns out from listening to the messages that this individual actually owned a business, and it was a non-stop string of people who had expected this person to show up at places that didn't. Various medical appointments, various repair appointments, and all the various things that go with the job, social engagements this person was supposed to go on, and there's probably over 100 messages. And so in this silence, and kind of glancing over at the spot on the floor from time to time, and sometimes sometimes you kind of had to step over it because of where it was basically at a central nexus in the house. But you're listening to it, and it's just like all this stuff going on, and the initial reaction at the time it's very humbling, because you're just sitting there going, wow, all these people kind of realized she was not where she was supposed to be, but still the body ends up sitting there for over 2 weeks. And what would have happened if it wasn't summer? What if it was in the middle of winter and maybe the furnace had gone out or something? It could have been even longer. Now, sometime afterwards, I did some more thinking about this, and here's here's kind of the point. Hey, imagine a person with that many connections, family connections, social connections, business connections, um, and then personal business connections, where the type of people you go do business with, auto repair and the various doctors and everything else like that. Imagine all these connections realizing she hasn't shown up for something, and nobody reacting to it, to where she's sitting there dead in her house for 2 weeks. It's like, you'd like to think that if you died, everyone would notice very quickly and and come have you picked up. But so imagine a person, um, I believe they're in their maybe late 50s, person in their late 50s who's got that much of a huge, massive imprint on the people around them can literally just disappear for 2 weeks before somebody realizes something wrong, and the only way they figure out something's wrong is the smell of the corpse. Okay? So if a whole adult person with massive amounts of social contacts can just basically drop off the face of the earth for 2 weeks without anyone noticing, how do you think a, a baby from a couple of months all the way down to a couple of days fares in terms of being able to disappear? Okay, you're talking about a being that might have only one person who's aware of them, maybe two, maybe three. It would be very easy for a person under those conditions to utterly disappear to the point where no one is ever going to know about it unless somebody tells a story. Okay, so I'm throwing that out there as a backdrop to the problem that's essentially unfolding before us now. Now, if you end a life deliberately, it's murder. And I will say that abortion is the murder of a human being. There's no doubt about it. But also, it's very different. Now, it's different for the very reason I just explained there, where making an adult, killing an adult and making them go away is very difficult. Killing, a being that's absolutely tiny and making them going away is relatively easy. Now, one of the things we talk about when we get into the whole pro-life debate is the abortion exceptions. Now, and I understand, I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty of the agreements and disagreements with this, but I would say the overwhelming majority of people, or at least a majority of people, agree that there are exceptions for incest, there are exceptions for rape, and there are exceptions for the life of the mother, and there are exceptions for truly unviable babies. Now, if there are exceptions, doesn't that infer immediately that we're looking at a slightly different kind of murder? The exceptions with most forms, because we differentiate talking about in the adult world, we differentiate between the difference between self-defense and murder. So ignore self-defense because that's not what we're talking about. Now, when you get into murder, we do come up with different categories based on exactly the situation that occurred, what the thought process was involved for the person. But we don't generally accept the idea of a mercy killing against somebody else's will. We don't generally, you could sit there and say, okay, yeah, the person was in really horrible pain. I did them a huge favor, etc., etc. But if the other person didn't want to go, there is no exception. So what I'm getting at here is essentially abortion is a little bit different. You have to acknowledge it. Now, I'll throw if you're kind of going, yeah, I don't buy that. So overwhelmingly, we look at most of the abortion laws, the ones anti-abortion laws, basically make it so that uh, the mother is not culpable in the crime of the murder. Okay, so if she hires a person to kill another person, you would arrest her for doing this. Yet, if she pays somebody to kill her unborn baby, you're going to say, oh, no, no, that's an exception. Well, okay, you're starting to see this isn't exactly the same as, okay, it is murder, but it's a very different case because it doesn't behave the same way. If you actually believed it worked the exact same way, the mother should be arrested at that point, or charged at least. So a lot of it honestly comes from political expediency. You realize that charging the mother is going to kind of blow up in your face. If you have an abortion law that you're hoping actually changes things, if your goal is to reduce the number of abortions, and then you basically get the population so upset by arresting the women who are consenting to abortions, and you basically lose your law, you've basically failed. So you're choosing political expediency over something you're calling murder. You're treating people differently. You're treating uh, the woman as if she has an automatic diminished capacity where she can't be responsible for anything that happens. Um, Based on most of the laws I see, this would be true even if she does it by her own hands. And in these days, that could be taking 2 pills. So if you look at murders in the adult world, if obviously we realize there is no way to stop murder. Uh, and realistically, I mean, you could say, well, our goal is to stop murder, but realistically, you know it's never going to happen. So essentially, law enforcement and the judicial system, in terms of how murder works, is we really have an end goal of protecting the population from people who've already murdered. That's our primary goal. We want to take these people off the streets. We want to evaluate them. And, if the situation is that they can somehow return and we think it's safe, they'll get let out. And if not, we will keep them in indefinitely. In some cases, we'll actually take their lives. So the goal per se is to try to mitigate the amount of damage murderous individuals can do by depriving them of their liberty. Uh, the actual possibility of ending murder is very remote and unlikely. Some of it obviously is deterrence, but it's one of those things where I'd say not too many people. Well, okay, maybe that's not true. I was about to say not too many. I don't think if for some reason you made murder, if you just pulled away the murder laws, how many people would just go, oh, well, gee, there's a whole bunch of people I want to kill. I don't know. Maybe there are some people out there who are actually deterred by the laws, because I personally wouldn't. I have a hard time getting into that mindset where someone's like, yeah, I'd really murder someone, but can't do it because it's against the law. So looking at, let's shift away from the adult world, away from how things are working in terms of what happens when a person murders another person. When we go back and look at this prospective mother deciding to end her pregnancy and therefore murdering a baby, what is our goal here by banning abortion? Well, realistically, we know that we can't stop all abortions. So the idea is trying to reduce the number. So are we concerned about the mother if we're going to, let's say, arrest her for the murder of a child? Are we trying to prevent her from doing this again by locking her up? It seems, because for the most part, she's not a danger to the rest of society. And if our goal is to lock her up so she doesn't get pregnant again and have another abortion, uh, I don't think that's really in line with what we have in mind for how we're doing things. So if our goal is reduction, how much reduction is acceptable? Is less than it was the year before acceptable? Or is our goal some kind of zero tolerance? And so here are some arguments. It's kind of interesting because at the time I gave this speech, these particular arguments I had never heard before. And now I'm actually hearing them pop up from the pro-abortion side of things. And the reaction from the pro-life side is to go, oh, no, 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 no. We don't want to do any of this stuff. But you're actually seeing some of it pop up into the laws, or at least some of the laws are confusing people into believing this is the kind of things that are happening. So, you know, if you actually want, let's say your goal is to get as close to zero abortions as possible, here are the things you have to do. Well, the first thing you have to do is essentially make all medical people reporters to the government. They need to let the investigative state know anytime something suspicious has happened where there's a possibility that an abortion has occurred. Because obviously medical professionals are the ones who are most likely going to see this. So they would likely be able to detect the difference between an abortion and a miscarriage, and they definitely would be able to tell the difference between an abortion and a miscarriage in terms of the two pill system for aborting a child, because it's very, very different than a miscarriage. So another thing you'd have to do if your goal is to get to zero abortions is you need to absolutely control the abortion medications. Now, you may say, oh, they're prescription medicine. Well, I'll tell you right now, I can get you pretty much any prescription medicine you want through the mail, with the exception of like painkillers, with no prescription and no oversight whatsoever. So I guarantee you that these abortion medications can be mailed very easily. So how do we stop this from happening? Do we shut down or do massive searches of incoming international packages to ensure that people aren't buying from overseas pharmacies? Do the states that decide to ban these pills go through all the mail and packages of businesses from other states being sent to this states where they want to ban the abortions? Do uh, do we search vehicles for them the same way we search for illicit drugs? What kind of penalties are we going to impose for people being in possession of these drugs? What kind of penalties are we going to impose for people who are clearly selling these drugs? And some people say, "Oh, no, 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 we're not talking about that at all." Well, but you just said you wanted to get abortions as close to zero as possible. So essentially, and this is just so you put the pills into perspective, 56% of all current abortions happen via the pills. So if you're just going to let the pills flow freely, uh, your ability to make a dent in this is going to be pretty limited. In fact, you can almost guarantee that under these circumstances, that number is going to go closer to 100% if you have any kind of crackdown on the availability of the procedures. Okay, so what do we do in the case of a miscarriage? Well, I can guarantee in my story I told you earlier with finding the body in the house, I can absolutely guarantee that that body was brought to the coroner, autopsied, and they determined cause of death and all that other stuff. In that particular case, no foul play was suspected. So, are we just going to assume anytime we find a dead baby, dead fetus, a preborn baby, that anytime we find it, it's just like, okay, well, it's no big deal, because we're not going to go the route of investigating every time we find one of these a little body someplace, or if somebody shows up at a clinic going, "Oh, I just had a miscarriage. Oh, here's what's in the bag." I'm sorry. But so what do you? So if we're not going to investigate a corpse to see if there was foul play, that's going to let a whole lot of abortions just go by the wayside. What about, uh, let's say, a doctor or even just a normal person looks and says, "Huh, look at that woman. She's got a little bit of belly. Looks like she's filling out in the right places. Kind of looks like she's pregnant." And then maybe a month later, that person looks again and says, "Oh, they've suddenly lost a lot of mysterious weight." Is that worthy of an investigation? Maybe. Um, what about pregnancy kits? Do we control pregnancy kits? Do we register them? Uh, do we take them off the over the shelf market and they become issued by they can only be used uh, with medical supervision? What happens when a doctor does a pregnancy test and determines that it's positive? Are we going to create some kind of registry to make sure that we know that this baby has its best, has the greatest opportunity to make it to birth? What about travel? Can a pregnant woman travel to another state where she can have an abortion? What if that woman tells everybody outright? What if she goes down to her local news station and broadcasts? Okay, sorry, I went back in time. Let's say she goes to the internet and tells everybody, yep, I'm crossing state borders because we can't do abortions here, so I'm going to go over there and I am absolutely positively getting an abortion. Okay? Well, this is murder, right? So if in any other case where somebody announces, I am going to go kill somebody, it's an absolute fact, I'm not joking, this is not a stunt, I am going to go kill somebody, uh, police do something about that. But in this case we won't, or will we? Okay. And I'm not throwing these things out to be like hyperbolic, and I'm not throwing these out to, you know, um, bolster one side over the other. What I'm trying to say is, if you're really going to do what you say you're going to do, if aborting the baby is exactly the same as murder, exactly the same as one adult shooting another adult in the chest and killing them, then you got to treat it exactly the same. However, here's the problem. If you implement the procedures needing to control any of the things I just talked about, you will create an absolute police state. It will be awful. So you're essentially going to, in order to prevent murders, you're going to dramatically uh, impose on the liberty of many people, especially women. So I'm not saying we can't do anything here. What I am saying is you have to look at these. You can't just blow them off as, oh, well, they're hyperbola. No, they're real concerns, because you are telling people that your goal is to try to eliminate abortions or get them down to the lowest number possible. So if you aren't going to do any of these things, then you obviously don't really think abortion's murder. But if you do, well, then you got to do something. Okay, so one of the awkward things that I've been put in because of this Dobbs decision, okay, because I was expecting this never to come in my lifetime, but I wanted it to. So what I was thinking was, well, if this ever happened, it would be great if this was down at the state level. And then each state could come up with their own policies, and then we could start having this organic process happen again where we could start saying, okay, what works and what doesn't. Is there a place we can come to compromise? Is there a place where this all works out? And because I never thought it through, I'm at the awkward stage of, it's like, yeah, I'm really happy what the Supreme Court did, but in my own state, I have no idea at this moment exactly what I want my state to do about it. So, uh, but it's something I'm obviously giving consideration. Will eventually come up with an answer, but at the moment, I don't have one. Some of the things that are kind of strange and mysterious. Now, a lot of people who are against abortion um, really get the statistics wrong. We have essentially, if you look at a statistical chart of abortion since 1973, you have a situation where you have kind of a low level number, and actually, there were numbers tracking before 73. And so you basically have this low level line happening. You have a kind of a jump in 73, and then you have a really big jump in 74, and then you have kind of this trend line going up at a rate of about 100,000 a year. Now, one of the things to understand is, because people say, well, look what Roe v. Wade did, because you see that giant jump in 73 and 74. Well, logically, if you understand statistics, you got to realize that that's not a real representation of what happened. That's a representation of a change in reporting. if we had this huge outbreak of hippie free love in the late 60s and early 70s, it didn't take 5, 6 years for it to kick in. It was happening within, the normal 9 months of each individual event. So the numbers were always on the uprise. That's a given. That trend line, if you look at the 100,000 per year trend line, it probably was roughly the same before that. Now, in the 80s, we leveled off at about 1.5 million abortions per year. Growth kind of came to a stop. And then in 1992, there was a slow drop. And this drop has been more or less in progress. I think current numbers haven't been calculated beyond 2020 yet. There may be a slight increase in that year, but the general idea is the numbers in 1992 were around 1.5 million. They trended down to about 700,500. Excuse me, 750,000. Within the last 5 years, and there was a slight uptick to about 950 more recently. So these trend numbers, other than telling us that Roe v. Wade, all they did was confirm an existing trend. They did not change the trend. The trend was already in progress. What really needs to be looked at is what caused the trend to plateau and what caused the trend to start going back down. Perhaps in 1992, the trend started down because of the fantastic moral leadership of President Clinton. Who knows? But understanding those trends could have a lot of impact on getting you to where you want to go. Because the downward trend was a voluntary trend. People chose to go in that direction, and that seems to be, if you're against abortion, the right direction to be going. So, as I mentioned, 54% of current abortions are now via the two-pill system. Big issue is now controlling that, because it's going to be very difficult. It's going to be as easy to control as it is to control marijuana. Because we have marijuana-free zones all over the United States. I'm sure you can tell that's sarcasm. So the key thing here, in my opinion, is looking for methodologies to bring the free market into play here. Okay, right now, because of abortion clinics, and pardon me for getting a little gross here, the value of human beings has been reduced to the value of their parts. And if you're not familiar with what I'm getting at, do some research, because I don't really want to talk about that, because it's pretty awful. So what we want to do is figure out a way to alter the free market's view of things, so that a person isn't the value of its separate parts, but the value of the individual is being brought to life and continuing and contributing. And I think there are ways of doing that. Another statistic that's important to know is that essentially we have abortions for various reasons. Obviously, some of them are for some people it's a form of birth control. Some people they can't afford another child. Some people it's life of the mother, life of the child, rape, incest, etc. Now, to get a scope of things, essentially everything that isn't a convenience or economic decision. So all the hard cases that we were talking about. So rape, incest, uh, prenatal defects, danger to the mother, account for, depending on whose numbers you use, somewhere between 3.5 to 7% of the abortions. So that means somewhere between 93% or higher are done for convenience reasons or economic reasons. Uh, that gives us a lot of insight in both terms of if we want to attack the abortion issue from the hard case side, if we're trying to say, hey, and I see that I've seen some really heart-wrenching videos out there where you got people who say, hey, I'm the product of a rape, and I'm happy I wasn't aborted. And I really get that. I really understand that. But if you're looking at the numbers of that, if you could trade that 7.5% for the remaining, or excuse me, 7% for the remaining 93, it would be very much worth it. So although I empathize strongly with those viewpoints, I was going to use the analogy throwing out the baby with the bathwater, but maybe that's inappropriate here. I think it's probably the wrong time to be approaching those issues. Uh, your return on investment for that is going to be low. I mean, if you're talking about just convincing people otherwise, yeah, absolutely. But if you're talking about making it a law, you're probably doing more harm than good. I mean, if we can significantly reduce the other 93%, I think the 7% of the hard cases will follow in its own way. Okay, so what happens? Let's say somehow we could get abortions down to a very, very minimal level. What'll occur is we will have a 25% increase in growth rate in the country. Essentially, right now we're at about 1.9 children per family. It will change to 2.4 children per family. Now, just in terms of that, I'm happy with the 2.4 number because it's a good thing because it takes away from the population implosion problem that I'm concerned with. But it does create real problems. What happens when we eventually saturate the number of families who can care for children that aren't wanted? And so people say, oh no, if you look at the numbers, it can't possibly happen. We don't know that. I would say it's a very real possibility. Now, I'm not saying that's a reason to just let abortion fly out without challenging it. I'm saying is you have to have an answer other than it's not going to happen. You have to have a solution to it. Okay. We're also going to see a huge increase in the amount of people with things like Down syndrome and other severe handicaps. Again, not advocating for abortion in these cases. I'm saying you have to have an answer to it. You can't, there has to be a way of figuring out how the value of these individuals to society, to the market, can be translated in a way that makes it so that they will be supported in such a way that's not a drain on the rest of society. Um, and there's a lot of different things that could come into play. Part of it has to be in terms of looking at uh, we our adoption laws need to change dramatically. Uh, we have to be more willing to allow adoptions to occur than we are now. They have to be easier. They have to be cheaper. They need to be as close to free as humanly possible. So obviously, there's a huge problem with government being in the way. Uh, and a lot of that comes down to the way government handles uh, what used to be the orphanage issue. Uh, we may need to see the return of orphanages on a large scale again. That's something that has to be kept in mind. There may be situations where, I mean, huge economic downturns where people are going to say, oh, well, I'd really like to adopt, but I'm going to put it off for a few years. Well, if unless you're adjusting your population growth rate uh, to the economic situation, that won't work. So there has to be a methodology for where these children end up going. Um, there has to be a dramatic improvement in our medical care system. Uh, the I mean, one, I would think it's a possibility. I mean, obviously, we're talking, future tech stuff, but it's something to keep in mind. I mean, what if a embryo, I mean, right now we're able to harvest a fertilized egg and store it for quite some time. Storage is not perfect. You do end up losing some. But let's say technology improved to the point where you could do that out to maybe 2 months. A fetus develops up to the 2 month point, and we still have a way of putting on ice somehow. Are we willing to accept the idea that maybe a certain percentage of them aren't going to make it through the freezing, rethawing, and putting in somebody else's womb process? Uh, if we let medical technology do the things it needed to do, could it produce an artificial womb? If a developing baby could be essentially extracted at any point and put into an artificial womb and then born later, well, we need to deal with the repercussions of what happens to that baby on the other end. You can't assume there's always going to be someone to take care of them, so there needs to be a methodology in place to deal with it. Um, Also need to look at the idea of getting government out of the way of surrogacy. So a woman who's basically pregnant and doesn't want to be might be willing to carry her child to birth if there were significant compensation involved with this. Government does get in the way of these things and probably shouldn't be. I mean, yeah, it does create some messy situations, and yeah, it's not always ideal, but if our choice is between dead baby and less than ideal situation, I think we would prefer to lean towards the less than ideal situation. Um, we do need to rethink some of the ways we look at our current family situation. We do have a big problem with unmarried couples. We do have a problem with uh, divorces happening, or at least in breakups of these couples who aren't married. And we need to look deeply into what we are doing at a government and societal level to cause these problems. And we need to look at repairing it. And I'm talking obviously tall orders. There's a lot of different things in play here. Okay, well, I hope for those of you who've been asking that I've recreated the major points of the great speech I gave some years ago. I hope I've given you some food for thought. Now, I think the really big thing that comes into play here, I think where the people who want to diminish abortion to the greatest extent, where they can make the greatest gains, is by not doing the same knee-jerk reaction that the other side is going to take. In the states that are essentially pro-abortion, some of them are going to take it right up to the line, or we're going to be on the doorstep of infanticide. I think by letting them do what they need to do, they will horrify the population in such a way that they're not going to have a lot of people on their side. So I think it's critical that people who are against abortion don't horrify people by taking it too far the other way. I think the way to do it is to find a way to sit down constructively with the other side in your state and say, okay, where can we compromise? Where's a place we can meet? If you are in a red state and you are against abortion, you are in an absolutely unique situation for a conservative person. Up until this point, virtually any time a conservative compromises with a liberal, it ends up increasing the amount that government's getting involved in things, thus to your detriment. In this case, almost every compromise we can come up with is actually going to put things in our direction in a good way. So the question is are you willing to make some compromises in terms of making improvements so that we can prove our points and gain further compromises down the road, so that we can actually do what Richard Maybury had in mind, where we see this organic process, where we can look at the different states and say, okay, yeah, those guys are essentially doing infanticide. We don't like that. These guys have found some kind of happy medium, and these guys have been slowly moving things in the direction of getting rid of abortion in such a way that everybody kind of looks at it and says, oh, okay, things didn't turn out as bad as we thought they would, and we can kind of live with what it's going to because it didn't happen overnight. So, yeah, it's not the speech I gave 20 years ago, but I think a lot of the points are there. Hope you enjoyed it. If you're not a subscriber, please subscribe. If you like this, like it. And if you have commentary, please comment. I try to answer comments. I mean, I'm hoping I get to a point where I get so many comments I can't really answer them, but at this point where I'm only getting a handful with each video, I will do my best to answer every comment. And just for those of you who asked for a video on anarchy, I've not forgotten about you. I'm hoping to do this as a joint video, and my co-host isn't ready for that one yet. So I haven't forgot about you. Thank you for spending time with me. Hope you have a good evening.